Frank Sinatra was standing in the lobby of the Fontainebleau Hotel when he saw the envelope. It wasn't handed to him by a bellhop or a fan. It was sitting on the front desk with his name written on it in handwriting he recognized immediately. Dean Martin's handwriting. Frank picked up the envelope. He didn't open it right away. He just held it, feeling the weight of it, knowing that whatever was inside was going to complicate his life. Because that's what Dean did. Dean Martin had a talent for creating situations that required Frank to make decisions he didn't want to make. The date was February 14th, 1958, Valentine's Day. But there was nothing romantic about what was happening in Miami Beach that weekend. Frank and Dean were there to perform. The Rat Pack was at the height of its power. They owned Las Vegas. They owned Hollywood. They owned every room they walked into. But Miami in February of 1958 was different. Miami was mob territory, and the mob had rules that even Frank Sinatra couldn't break. Frank opened the envelope. Inside was a single piece of paper with 5 words written on it. "I need you tonight, Dean." That was it. No explanation, no details. Just 5 words that told Frank everything he needed to know. Dean was in trouble. And when Dean Martin was in trouble, it was never simple trouble. It was the kind of trouble that involved men in expensive suits who didn't like to be told no. Frank folded the note and put it in his pocket. He looked at his watch. It was 6 p.m. He had a show at 9 o'clock. Dean's show started at 7 o'clock. Frank walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the penthouse floor. He knew exactly where Dean would be. Dean was always in the same place when things went wrong. He was in his room, sitting by the window, drinking scotch, waiting for Frank to figure out how to fix it. The door to Dean's suite was unlocked. Frank walked in without knocking. Dean was sitting in a chair by the window, exactly where Frank knew he would be. He had a glass in his hand. He wasn't drinking it. He was just holding it, staring out at the ocean. Frank closed the door behind him. "What did you do?" Frank asked. Dean didn't turn around. "I didn't do anything." "Then why am I here?" Dean took a sip of his drink. Then he said, "Santo Trafficante wants me to sing at his daughter's wedding." Frank didn't say anything. He just stood there, letting the name hang in the air between them. Santo Trafficante Jr. was not a man you said no to. He was the boss of the Tampa crime family. He controlled gambling, prostitution, and drug trafficking throughout Florida and parts of Cuba. He had connections to every major crime family in America. He was one of the most powerful mobsters in the country, and apparently his daughter was getting married. Frank walked over to the bar and poured himself a drink. "When's the wedding?" "Tomorrow night." "What did you tell him?" Dean finally turned to look at Frank. "I told him I couldn't do it. I told him I had a show here. I told him I was booked." Frank closed his eyes and took a long drink. "You told Santo Trafficante no." "I told him the truth." "Dean, the truth doesn't matter to a guy like Santo, you know that." Dean stood up and walked to the window. "I'm not one of his nightclub singers, Frank. I'm not some kid he can snap his fingers at and I come running. I've got a contract here. I've got an audience. You've got a problem." Frank interrupted. "And now I've got a problem, because you know what's going to happen next. He's going to come to me. He's going to ask me to talk to you. And when I tell him I talked to you and you still said no, he's going to take it personally. And when Santo Trafficante takes something personally, people disappear." Dean sat back down in his chair. He looked tired. Not physically tired, spiritually tired. Tired of the game. Tired of the compromises. Tired of being Dean Martin the entertainer instead of Dino Crusetti from Steubenville, Ohio, who just wanted to sing songs and be left alone. "I'm tired of this, Frank," Dean said quietly. "I'm tired of these guys thinking they own us. We're not their property. We're performers. We have lives. We have careers that don't depend on them." Frank sat down across from Dean. "You really believe that?" "I want to believe it." "Well, believing it and living it are two different things. You know how this works. These guys, they helped us when we needed help. They put us in their clubs. They made sure we got paid. They protected us when other people tried to push us around. And now they want favors. That's the deal. That's how it's always been." Dean looked at Frank with something close to desperation in his eyes. "So what? We just keep doing favors forever. We keep showing up whenever they call. We keep pretending like we're friends when really we're just what?" Frank asked. Dean didn't answer. He didn't have to. They both knew what he was going to say. They were just employees. High-paid, famous, powerful employees. But employees nonetheless. And Santo Trafficante was their boss, whether they liked it or not. There was a knock on the door. Dean and Frank looked at each other. Dean stood up and walked to the door. He opened it. Standing in the hallway was a man neither of them had seen before. He was in his 50s, wearing a dark suit, with the kind of face that suggested he had done things he would never talk about. "Mr. Martin," the man said, "Mr. Trafficante would like to speak with you. He's downstairs in the restaurant. He's expecting you now." Dean started to speak, but Frank stood up and walked to the door. "Tell Mr. Trafficante that Dean and I will be down in 10 minutes. The man looked at Frank. There was no recognition in his eyes, no acknowledgement that he was speaking to Frank Sinatra. He was just a messenger delivering a message. "Mr. Trafficante said now." Frank smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. "And I said 10 minutes. Tell him we're on our way." The man stared at Frank for a long moment. Then he nodded and walked away. Frank closed the door and turned to Dean. You're going to do the wedding. Frank, you're going to do the wedding, Dean. Because if you don't, Santo's going to make an example out of you, and I can't protect you from that. Nobody can. Dean sat back down. He looked defeated. So that's it. He says jump and we ask how high. Frank walked over and put his hand on Dean's shoulder. That's not how I would put it. I would say he asks for a favor, and we do the favor because that's how we stay alive in this business. That's how we keep working. That's how we keep the life we've built. They walked downstairs together. The restaurant was nearly empty. It was the kind of empty that happens when important people want privacy. Santo Trafficante was sitting at a table in the corner, alone. He was a heavy-set man with dark eyes and a calm demeanor that somehow made him more frightening than if he had been loud and aggressive. Frank and Dean walked to the table. Santo didn't stand up. He just gestured to the chairs across from him. They sat down. Santo looked at Dean. I hear you're busy tomorrow night. Dean started to respond, but Frank spoke first. Dean's schedule is complicated right now, Santo, but we're going to work it out. He'll be at the wedding. Santo shifted his gaze to Frank. I wasn't talking to you, Frank. Frank didn't flinch. I know, but Dean works with me. Who make decisions together, and we've decided he'll be there. Santo leaned back in his chair. He picked up his wineglass and took a sip. Dean, do you let Frank speak for you? Dean looked at Frank, then back at Santo. Frank's right. I'll be there. I apologize for the confusion. I thought I had a conflict, but I can make it work. Santo smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. Good. My daughter Rosa is very excited. She's a big fan of yours. She has all your records. She tells everyone that Dean Martin is going to sing at her wedding. I would hate to disappoint her. The implication was clear. Disappointing Rosa meant disappointing Santo, and disappointing Santo had consequences that went beyond hurt feelings. What time do you need me? Dean asked. The wedding starts at 7. The reception is at 9. I'd like you to sing during dinner. Maybe 4 or 5 songs. Nothing too long. Just enough to make my daughter happy. Dean nodded. I'll be there at 8. Santo stood up. Frank and Dean stood up as well. Santo extended his hand to Dean. Dean shook it. Thank you, Dean. This means a lot to my family. Then Santo turned to Frank. Frank, I appreciate you helping Dean see reason. You're a good friend to him. Frank didn't respond. He just nodded. Santo walked away, leaving them standing there. Dean and Frank went back upstairs. Dean poured himself another drink. Frank watched him. You did the right thing, Frank said. Dean didn't look at him. Or did I just prove that I'm exactly what I said I didn't want to be? Frank didn't have an answer for that, because Dean was right. They had just proven that when Santo Trafficante called, they came running, and no amount of fame or money or power changed that basic fact. I'll go with you tomorrow night, Frank said. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, but I will. Dean finally looked at Frank. Why? Because that's what we do. We show up for each other, even when it's something we don't want to do. Dean finished his drink and set the glass down. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed if I'd just worked in my father's barbershop and lived a normal life. Frank smiled. You'd be miserable. You know that. Maybe, but at least I'd be free. The wedding was at a private estate in Coral Gables. Frank and Dean arrived together at 8:30 p.m. The place was filled with people who all had the same look. Expensive suits, expensive jewelry, expensive smiles that didn't mean anything. Santo greeted them at the door. He was in a tuxedo, looking like any proud father at his daughter's wedding, except for the fact that everyone in the room knew exactly who he was and what he was capable of. Dean, Frank, thank you for coming. Rosa is thrilled. He led them through the crowd to a small stage that had been set up in the corner of the ballroom. There was a piano, a microphone, and a small band. Whenever you're ready, Santo said. Then he walked away to join his family. Dean stepped onto the stage. The room quieted down. He picked up the microphone and looked out at the crowd. Good evening, everyone. I'm Dean Martin, and I'm here tonight to help celebrate Rosa and Anthony's wedding. Congratulations to the happy couple. There was polite applause. Dean nodded to the piano player and they started the first song. He sang That's Amore. He sang Everybody Loves Somebody. He sang Voltaire. He sang Memories Are Made of This. And he sang You're Nobody Till Somebody Loves You. Frank watched from the side of the room. He watched Dean perform like nothing was wrong, like this was just another gig, like he wasn't standing on a stage singing for a mob boss who had essentially ordered him to be there. And Frank realized something as he watched. Dean Martin was better at this than Frank was. Frank fought. Frank pushed back. Frank made it clear when he didn't want to do something, but Dean just smiled and sang and made everyone feel like he was happy to be there. It was a survival skill. It was the skill Dean had learned growing up in Steubenville, where you didn't fight the guys who ran the town. You just nodded and smiled and did what you had to do to get by. After the 5th song, Dean thanked the crowd and stepped off the stage. Santo met him with a glass of champagne. That was beautiful. Dean, Rosa is so happy. Thank you. Dean shook his hand. My pleasure, Santo. She's a beautiful bride. Santo smiled. You should stay for dinner, both of you. We have plenty of food. Frank started to decline, But Dean spoke first. We'd love to. He sat through dinner at a table with people they didn't know. They made small talk. They laughed at jokes that weren't funny. They clinked glasses with men who had probably killed people. And through it all, Dean never stopped smiling, never stopped playing the role, never let anyone see that inside. He was screaming. It was almost midnight when they finally left. They got in the car and Frank started driving back to the hotel. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Dean said, "You know what the worst part is? What I was good tonight. I sang well. The songs sounded good. Rosa looked happy. And part of me felt proud of that. Part of me felt good that I made that girl's wedding special." Frank glanced at him. "That's not the worst part, Dean. That's the only part. You did something nice for someone. That's all it was." Dean shook his head. "No, Frank, it wasn't. It was a transaction. Santo ordered me to be there and I was there. That's not doing something nice. That's just being owned." Frank pulled the car over to the side of the road. He turned off the engine and looked at Dean. "You want to know what I think? Not really. I think you're one of the most talented guys I've ever met. I think you're funnier than anyone gives you credit for. I think you're a better singer than you pretend to be. And I think you're so desperate to pretend like none of this matters to you that you've convinced yourself you're just some guy who got lucky." Dean looked out the window. "Maybe I did just get lucky." "No," Frank said. "You didn't. You worked for this. You earned this. And yeah, sometimes that means we have to do things we don't want to do. Sometimes that means singing at weddings for guys like Santo Trafficante. But that doesn't mean you're owned. It means you're smart enough to know how to survive." Dean didn't respond. He just sat there, staring out at the dark Miami night. Frank started the car again and drove back to the hotel. When they got there, Dean got out and started walking toward the entrance. Then he stopped and turned back. "Frank here. Thanks for coming with me tonight." Frank nodded. "That's what friends do." Dean smiled. It was a real smile this time. Not the Dean Martin stage smile. Just a tired, grateful smile from a man who was glad he didn't have to face the world alone. "Good night, Frank." "Good night, Dean." Frank watched Dean walk into the hotel. Then he sat in the car for a while, thinking about what Dean had said. About being owned. About being free. About the difference between the two. And Frank realized that Dean was right. They weren't free. They never had been. From the moment they had accepted help from men like Santo Trafficante, they had made a deal. And the deal was simple. "We'll make you famous. We'll make you rich. We'll make you powerful. And in return, when we call, you come." That was the deal. That's what it had always been. And there was no getting out of it. 2 weeks later, Frank and Dean were back in Las Vegas performing at the Sands. They were on stage together, doing their usual routine. Frank would sing. Dean would make jokes. They would pretend to drink. They would pretend to not care. And the audience would eat it up. After the show, they were in Dean's dressing room when someone knocked on the door. It was a messenger. He handed Dean an envelope. Dean opened it. Inside was a thank you note from Santo Trafficante. It said, "Dean, Rosa hasn't stopped talking about the wedding. You made her the happiest girl in the world. If there's ever anything I can do for you, just ask. Your friend Santo." Dean read the note and handed it to Frank. Frank read it and handed it back. "See," Frank said, "now he owes you a favor." Dean crumpled up the note and threw it in the trash. "I don't want his favors, Frank. I just want to be left alone." Frank stood up and walked to the door. "Then you're in the wrong business, pal." Dean Martin performed at dozens of private events over the years. Weddings, birthdays, anniversaries. Most of them were for men. Like Santo Trafficante, men who wanted to show their families and their associates that they were important enough to have Dean Martin sing at their parties. And every time Dean showed up, he smiled, he sang, he made everyone feel special. And then he went home and poured himself a drink and stared out the window and wondered what his life would have been like if he had just said no that first time. But he never said no, because saying no to men like Santo Trafficante wasn't an option. Not for Dean, not for Frank, not for anyone who wanted to survive in Las Vegas in the 1950s and 1960s. Frank Sinatra died in 1998. Martin had died 3 years earlier, on Christmas Day, 1995. When Frank heard the news, he didn't say much. He just sat quietly for a while, remembering the nights at the Sands, remembering the laughs, remembering the music, and remembering that night in Miami when Dean had written him a note that said, "I need you tonight." Because that's what their friendship had been built on. Not the fame, not the money, not the movies or the records or the awards. It was built on moments when one of them needed the other and the other one showed up. No questions asked. That was the deal between Frank and Dean. And unlike the deal they had made with men like Santo Trafficante, it was a deal they both honored until the very end.